Health outcomes. Changes due to interventions. To bring positive change, patient experiences and health must both improve. Healthcare costs must be lowered, and clinician and staff burnout has to end. But our problems are big. 133 million Americans have at least one chronic disease. 500,000 people are dying every year from hospital errors, injuries, and infection. The shortage of primary care professionals will be as much as 100,000 in just the next 5 years. Big problems require bigger solutions. Positive change needs acceleration. It needs to happen now. But these are not so easy solutions that many don't want to hear, and even few are willing to talk about. How to lead such a change? How to discover, discuss, and disrupt healthcare to make a difference now? This is VITALS, Visionary Health Leadership in Action.
Good evening, and welcome to VITALS, Visionary Health Leadership in Action. Tonight, we're going to talk about the T in VITALS, technology. Without technology, we can't really practice medicine. As a surgeon, the most I can do is place my hand on a wound to stop bleeding, but it's technology that facilitates everything we do, from the technologies in an operating room, to those used in rehabilitation, and to those used in life-sustaining treatments in the intensive care unit. It's been noted in numerous studies that technology is the #1 driving force for the increased cost in healthcare, accounting for as much as 40 to 50% of the increases we're seeing year over year. So while technologies are incredibly important in improving healthcare, we have to balance the impact it's having on unsustainable growth in the total cost of healthcare in America. That balancing act is often left to value assessment committees run by hospital facilities and payers who look at what is the benefit to the patient relative to the overall cost to the organization and trying to make a sound determination on which technologies we should be using. And things are becoming worse as technologies are advancing. In fact, many of you may be aware of the CAR T cell. While we're still trying to understand its total value proposition, the jury is out. We know that it does offer some improvement in the outcomes of patients with refractory lymphoma, but the cost is extraordinary. Publications have shown the cost for just a single dose of the cells that are utilized to treat the patient to run about $375,000. And total increased cost of care that may not be compensated for a facility like a hospital by the payer can run into the $500,000 to $1 million plus. So for most institutions that are running margins of about $20 to $50 million in the black to keep their enterprise alive and to grow their capabilities, it doesn't take very many patients to drop them into the red and have them losing money and not able to serve the rest of the community. So we have to judiciously look at these technologies, and our industry partners who create these are the key. We need them to be partners to focus on value in healthcare, markedly improving outcomes while helping us to control costs. Tonight, we're really fortunate to have a leader focused on just that. The T in VITALS, but also looking at the V, value in VITALS, and of course, with technology, the I, innovation. Tonight, we're going to hear from Mr. Mark Paul, a friend and a colleague who is the president of Stryker Neurovascular. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Mark Paul.
All right, thank you. I'd like to thank President Langell and to the Northeast Ohio Medical University for the opportunity to present tonight at the VITALS program. I thought I'd share a case study of ischemic stroke intervention as it has been able to generate both clinical value, but also value to healthcare systems. And I thought I'd share some information that walks everybody through how that was achieved. So stroke occurs every 40 seconds. Someone dies about every 3.5 minutes from ischemic stroke. Every year in the United States, there's approximately 800,000 strokes. Over the last 5 or 6 years, since this new procedure has been approved, we've gone from a very low percentage of addressable treatable stroke. And today in the United States, we're hovering only around 18% of ischemic strokes that are being treated. Ischemic stroke is the number 5 cause of death in the United States, but it's the number 1 cause of disability. 10% of these strokes are ischemic. 65% of all strokes are women of all ages. So when I talk about stroke, I want to just share the basics. First, what does stroke mean? You hear that word quite a bit. There's 2 different kinds. There's a hemorrhagic stroke where you have bleeding in the brain. You hear people use the term that their loved one threw a clot into the brain. That's an ischemia. But basically, stroke is an interruption of blood flow to the brain that causes the death of brain cells and impacts brain function. So basically, you're stopping oxygen from being delivered to the brain. Neurovascular procedures are really just microplumber procedures. If you have a leak, we can go in and we can stop that leak. And if you have a clog, such as an ischemic stroke, we can unclog that artery. Today, I'm going to focus on the unclogging of those arteries. So what are the signs? So 87% of all strokes are ischemic. And again, these are the blockages that are caused by clots. But I want everyone to be aware of what the symptoms are. The patient will be unable to communicate to you that they're having a stroke. It has to be friends and loved ones around that patient who can see that they're having a stroke and get them to the right center for treatment. So I want everyone to think of the word FAST. F stands for face. Half your face will almost always be impacted. So you can say, hey, mom, look at me, smile for me, frown for me. And one half of the face will respond, the other half will not. When you think of A, I want you to think of arm. Your arm and your hand on one side will almost always be impacted. S is for speech. Slurred speech, drunken-like speech, confused speech, repeated speech, irregular speech is a sign that an ischemic stroke is happening. And then the T is for time. You have to move very fast and you have to get to the right hospital. Not all hospitals, you have to get to the right hospital for the best care. So once an ischemic stroke begins, the patient loses 2 million neurons per minute. And once penumbra is dead in the brain, it never comes back. Sometimes patients will have small strokes called TIAs, trans-ischemic attacks, where the body is releasing little clots. So a patient may feel confused and disoriented and can't speak for a few minutes, and then they feel back to normal. These are actually signs of a bigger stroke that's coming. And so you need to watch for these signs and get to the right hospital for advanced care. So what happens when you have a stroke? The clot is made somewhere else in the body and it moves to the brain. It can happen in the heart, it can happen from creating the aortic arch or in your carotids. A piece of that clot breaks off and the blood flow literally pulls it deep into the brain, wedging into the artery once the size of the clot exceeds the size of the artery. And you can see from the image here that red portion of the brain is affected and becomes dead. If we don't treat rapidly, that red section you'll see on the imaging continues to grow until the stroke process is completed. But again, I'm reminding everyone you're losing 2 million neurons per minute. And once that brain penumbra is dead, it's gone forever. And there's some pretty important real estate up there. So depending where that clot goes is the brain function that becomes impacted. Walking, talking, moving your left arm, right arm, memory, swallowing, personality, paralysis. All these things take place once that part of the brain is dead. You can see the environment in which we operate. We wear lead clothing, we wear a lead jacket, a lead skirt, we put our sterile clothing over that. We work in dark rooms and we operate through your leg. So we make a small opening in your leg about the size of a golf tee. And with specially designed, very long, 5-foot long products that are about as big as a human hair, we traverse up through your femoral artery in your right leg, up your aorta, around your arch, up to your carotids, deep into the brain. And this is how we gain access to operate into your brain through your right leg. It's a less invasive approach. Another approach into the brain would be to cut your hair and cut your scalp and drill through your skull. and go into the brain that way. As one might imagine, it's more invasive and takes longer. We can get rapidly into the brain in 5 or 6 minutes. So here's a real case. Here's a real procedure. So we know where to operate. First, every patient has a CAT scan. The CAT scan will tell us whether it's a bleed or whether it's a clot. It's important to have that CAT scan because if you give IV TPA, the drug that's designed to dissolve clots, to the wrong kind of stroke patient who's having a bleed, that would be catastrophic for that patient. So we do the CAT scan first, we get IV TPA on board. Once we get the catheter systems in place and into the carotid, we shoot contrast. And the contrast tells us exactly where that clot is. And you can see in the far picture on the left, you can see where the artery abruptly stops. That stump, we know that there's a clot sitting there. Clots are invisible to us. We can't see them on fluoroscopy. So we use the landmarks of the contrast to tell us the blood has stopped to that part of the brain. And we know that on the other side of that stump should be a whole lot of arteries that are being blocked from receiving oxygen. The picture second to the right, we can have it's hard to see in these images, but the catheter wire system is in place and we're releasing the stent retriever cage into the clot. And you can actually start to see blood flow now moving through that area to the affected side of the brain. We then blow up a small balloon to stop the blood flow. And you can see the systems of care here with the products. You see a catheter with a balloon, 2 microcatheters, and a stent retriever. The stent retriever incorporates with the clot. We blow up the balloon to stop the blood flow for just a moment. And we pull that system all the way down to the catheter out the patient's leg. And you can see the clots that we retrieve there in the far right picture. But you can also see from the right, you can see the blood flow has been totally restored to that part of to that patient's brain. If we did not restore that blood flow, that part of the brain would die and die forever. So we have to move very, very quickly. It's also important to note, it doesn't take a big clot to kill you or to kill a loved one or to cause catastrophic events with their brain function. It just needs to be big enough to stop blood flow. So once you have a clot, it's very important to know where to go to be treated. Not all hospitals are designed to treat patients with this type of care. So you can see in my cartoon image here, you can see a patient has a stroke. It's not going to be the patient that calls 911. It usually is a family member. They call the ambulance. The ambulance comes. The majority of patients, unfortunately, take the wrong path to care. The ambulance picks them up and they take them usually to the nearest hospital, which may just be a primary stroke center, meaning they're going to stabilize them, they're going to give them a CAT scan, they're going to see what type of stroke it is. And once they realize it's an ischemic stroke, they call a new ambulance. The new ambulance comes, picks them up, and then takes them to a comprehensive stroke center, which I've labeled CSC there on the bottom of the planogram. That process on average takes 3 to 4 hours. Remember the 2 million neurons per minute statement that I made? Well, every hour is 3.6 years of brain loss. 3 hours is almost 11 years of brain loss. So what you want for you and your loved ones or anyone that you know is to go through that top path. You call the ambulance takes you immediately to a comprehensive stroke center. The stroke coordinator meets you at the door, you have the CAT scan, you're on the treatment table rapidly, usually within 15 to 20 minutes from hitting the doors of the ER. So what are the risk factors for stroke? Certainly high blood pressure, physical inactivity, smoking, and AFib. But I want to make a point here. Stroke isn't just for old people. It's not an old age disease. It impacts people of all ages, especially women. And so you need to be very, very aware of these symptoms and know where to go to be treated so they can be treated rapidly. It's also interesting to note that the fastest growing area of stroke are men and women 35 to 44 years old. And it's because of these health characteristics. So now let's look at the care of this. So there's 4 big questions whenever you go into any new procedure. In this case, for ischemic stroke, we had to prove, can we safely advance these devices through the peripheral arteries into the neurovasculature, deep into the brain and get up to the face of the clot? Yes, we proved we can do that very, very fast and very safely. Then we had to prove, can we mechanically grab that clot in the artery and safely remove it from the brain down through the catheter system and out the leg. We proved that. But now I'd like to focus on these last two big questions. And that is, can we prove that thrombectomy, removing the clot from the patient, is beneficial to the patient? We need data to prove that. Now, it seems logical, removing the clot from the brain or restoring oxygenated blood would be a great thing. But we had to prove we could do it safely and that restoring that oxygen was a great thing for that patient. Number two is the tougher one. Can we prove that it's worth the cost of care? Is it worth it? What's the cost to build these expensive rooms, to have these well-trained neurointerventional neurosurgeons on staff, and for them to go and grab that clot and pull it out? What's the cost to the healthcare system? What's the cost to society? So there's a very famous data scientist, Edwards Deming, who has a great quote that just resonates so much with me today, and I'm sure with everyone there. Without data, you're just another person with an opinion. So in today's healthcare systems, we have to have data that we can prove helps the patient, but also brings value to the healthcare system and to society. So let me tell you how this revolution started. About 4.5 years ago, a country decided to do a study on ischemic stroke, and it was the Netherlands. And they set up a very interesting study where we had these new devices that could remove clots, my devices and my competitors' devices. And they set up a trial where every single person in the country that had an ischemic stroke would be studied. And whether they went to a little hospital or a big hospital, a hospital with a comprehensive stroke center or not, every single stroke patient in a country. And you're able to do that kind of study in the Netherlands because it's a smaller country and there's a set amount of hospitals and everybody goes to one of those hospitals. Their study was so profound. The outcomes of that study were so profound, they had to stop the trial for ethics because the patients were doing so much better than those who were treated with just the medical arm. In other words, pulling the clot out was so beneficial that they had to stop the trial and they had to alert the rest of the world for them to stop their trials as well. And it was profound. And what you can see in the article here that was published in the New England Journal, we use a score called the Modified Rankin Scale. And it's a 1 through 6 scale. 0 means you're alive and you're healthy today. 6 is dead. And then everything else is a very measured scale of the impact of the stroke. And you can see from the control arm to the interventional arm, you want as many in the left side of the scale as possible. So on this side, you want those colored bars on the left to be bigger than below on the control arm. And it was profound. But now we had to say, well, we have one study. Can this study be repeated? Is this a repeatable thing in many countries around the world? And then even the bigger questions, is it worth it? Now, I kind of jumping the gun here. We did follow those patients out for 2 years, and they still showed a significant advancement. Now, to give you perspective on this 0 through 6, 0 is where all of us should be sitting today. 6 is dead. But 1 and 2, those patients can still go to work. They can clean themselves. They can feed themselves. They can take care of themselves. When you become a 3, you're usually living in your home and your family members are feeding you and cleaning you. 4 and 5, you're in institutions and you're usually not moving. So our whole goal is to get patients in as soon as possible, treat them as rapidly as possible so we can save the penumbra of their brain and move them from a 6, 5, 4, 3 to a 2, 1, or hopefully even a 0. So what happened? There were 6 other clinical trials going on around the world. They all had to stop that day. And what's interesting, they all had similar results. Unfortunately, they all use different colors in their bars, but the modified Rankin scale is still the same. And what you'll see in every one of these studies is the interventional arm beat the control arm. And so to make it exciting, doctors took all 7 studies and put them into a meta-analysis called the Hermes study. And it combined all 7 trials. And the number to treat, the NNT, is 2.6, which is amazingly strong. And you can see the control population, say at a 0 is a 5, but those treated with these devices to remove stroke, those are a 10. And you can see even those that received drugs to try and melt the clot or didn't melt the clot, the result was still the same across the board. So this changed everything, and it's now changed the treatment of stroke in 70 countries around the world. So, but all we did was we proved we could help the patient. We hadn't looked at cost. We hadn't looked at cost of the healthcare system. We hadn't looked at the cost of how treating stroke rapidly helps societies and helps families. So I'd like to share some data. Excuse me, let me take a sip of water here. A good friend of mine, Dr. Mayank Goyal, who is the world's leader in ischemic stroke and in data. And he studies every study. He's in charge of the Hermes data we just looked at. And he's also been running and collecting data on the cost of treating stroke. And I'm going to present some slides here with his permission that was just released. So how do we measure health benefits? Well, we use a very complicated equation that defines the quality adjusted life year, QALY. And we do that because we're trying to get to a true apples and apples comparison. But as we start doing these studies of value to healthcare systems and values to families, you can see that those that were treated with intervention live longer and live better lives. And again, remember that modified Rankin scale. If we can get you in and treated quickly and you're a 0 or a 1 or a 2, you can still drive a car, you can go to work, you can pay your taxes, you can take care of your family. But if you're 3 or above, it becomes a drain on families and a drain on the healthcare system. So we started doing cost analysis studies. We did one in the United States, one in the United Kingdom, Australia, and Sweden. And you can see that the findings were all very, very similar. And you can see in the quadrant to the far right and to the lower right is we see that patients lived longer and that it cost less money to take care of them with intervention. We also did details into subgroup analysis of age and gender and race. They were all very, very similar. So now we're starting to see, wow, we're helping society by treating patients sooner, but how do we turn that into a real dollar value? How do we do that? Well, when you look at what was just recently published for many of these trials, and we took one of the largest trials, the average thrombectomy procedure, the cost of the products, those catheters, the wires, the stent retrievers to remove that clot is just a little bit under $15,000. Compared to the medical arm that received IV TPA was around $5,000. So initially the cost to treat, to President Longel's comment earlier, well, those devices cost money and sometimes they can be expensive. And in this case, it is more expensive. But when you look over the lifetime of a patient, those that had a good outcome and they're a 0 cost about $10,000 a year annually to make sure they're okay. Those that are a 5 are $64,000. So how does that add up over time? And what's interesting is for every 10 minutes, if we could take every stroke patient and we could shave off 10 minutes of losing 2 million neurons per minute, just 10 minutes in the healthcare system saves over $242 million a year. And to families and society, almost another $250,000. So it's quite significant. And you can imagine if we could get every ambulance to pick up the patients quickly and get them to the right centers in their community, 60 minutes is over $1.5 billion. So our belief, again, challenging our paradigms, is that penumbra could live between 6 to 8 hours. And we have doctors and physicians and neurologists for the last 100 years that truly believed after 6 to 8 hours, the brain penumbra that's been impacted by the stroke is probably dead. As we were doing these studies, and as we got FDA approval, and we tried to treat a wider range of patients, we had many physicians telling us, hey, I treated patients that were way out on the scale, on the time scale, and they did very well. So we decided to run another pivotal trial. We named it the DAWN trial. Many patients wake up with a stroke. So you don't know when that stroke started. It could have been when they first went to sleep, or maybe right before they woke up. Or maybe you come home from work and your loved one's been on the floor for quite some time and you don't know when that stroke started. So we arbitrarily picked 24 hours. And whether it was a wake-up stroke or a late stage stroke, we still treated those patients. you can see the effect was just the same. You can see the thrombectomy arm. Again, you want bigger bars on the left than you want on the right. And you can see that those that were not treated, you can see how many died versus how many were in comas or in long-term care facilities. Versus above on the thrombectomy side, you can see that patients are in the 0, 1, and 2 categories did quite well. So every minute counts. And I don't want anyone to think they can take their time getting to the hospital thinking, well, now we have a 24-hour indication. No, it's all about getting to a hospital that treats you the right way as fast as possible. But even for those patients with a wake-up stroke or were found later in their homes, we can still treat them and have a very good outcome. So here's my conclusion. Outcome data is driving healthcare treatment for stroke around the world. In this case, we've been able to prove that we can safely get to the clot, that we can safely remove the clot from the body. We can also prove that we're saving healthcare system dollars by treating patients quickly and effectively. And we can also save dollars to societies, to families who are trying to pay and take care of healthcare costs later on in their lives. So time is brain, time is quality of life, and time is value for systems of care and society. So those are my initial comments today. I'd like to introduce Monica Robbins, who is the senior health correspondent from KYC TV Channel 3 there in Ohio. Monica, I'd like to welcome you to the conversation.
Hi, Mark. Thank you so much. And everyone, if you have any questions, feel free to put them in the Q&A section or the chat, and I'll ask the question for you. Mark, I'm curious. I know this is still relatively new research, but is thrombectomy becoming standard of care, or is it still a long way off? Or is it just standard of care in comprehensive stroke centers?
You know, it's changing rapidly in a good way. Not fast enough, but it is changing rapidly. When these products and procedures were first approved and this initial trial from Mr. Clean came out about 4.5 years ago, we probably had a dozen comprehensive stroke centers in the United States, but we had a lot of catheter-ready hospitals, meaning they had doctors that could do it, but they may not be on 24 hours a day, neurosurgery backup, and so forth. Today, we're well over 200 comprehensive stroke centers in the United States. So in almost every city in the United States and broader community, there's at least one and sometimes two comprehensive stroke centers. The sadness of it all is quite often, though, hospital or ambulances and the protocols they follow are set by someone usually in each county. And that county personnel and team, sometimes their committees, set the priority. So sometimes that priority is you pick them up and take them to the nearest hospital, but that may not be a stroke center, even though there might be a stroke center 2 more miles down the road. That difference in time can make all the difference in how the patient does when being treated later.
So how do we remedy this? Is it just that there needs to be new protocol relating to EMS? You know, what's the fix, if you will, and what does it take for a hospital to become a comprehensive stroke center?
Yeah, I think those are excellent questions, by the way. So first on the patient side, patients and their families, you should be Googling right now, where's the nearest comprehensive stroke center in the United States. They're very well publicized and published. American Heart has them all listed, and the list is always changing. So you should Google. I can tell you in my family, I have a note on my mother and father's fridge that says, if you're having these symptoms, do not go to Hospital X, which is very close to your home, but drive 5 miles further to the Comprehensive Stroke Center. So they know exactly. So I've told them all and I tell them all the time. So first, there's a patient responsibility. Secondarily, systems of care in the United States are changing slowly. Many states now are passing legislative laws demanding that these local counties put into their protocols that if it's deemed a viable stroke, that they take them directly to the nearest comprehensive stroke center, including Ohio. I believe it's actually in your legislative activities today. And as a society, we're supporting all those legislative activities. And over time, the hospitals are becoming more and more ready to become comprehensive stroke centers. You know, Monica, it's a high bar. You have to have doctors on call 24 hours a day. You have to have neurologists on call. You have to have enough beds. The ER has to meet certain parameters, and you have to treat so many patients a year to meet that threshold. So it's a high bar, but more and more of them are coming online every single day across the United States.
Yeah, we're pretty lucky in Northeast Ohio. We have, you know, the majority of our hospitals are CSCs, but for the people who live in the rural settings, I'm hearing from you is that you kind of have to be your own best advocate. And the interesting thing you had said was that when someone is having a stroke, they likely don't even know they're having a stroke. So what happens if I'm home alone?
I know that is the scary thing. And it usually goes like this. Usually there is someone home and the patient will say, I feel really weird. Or they're thinking, I can't move my left body and I can't really speak. And so their first inclination is to go lay down and not tell anyone. And that's the saddest part of stroke is the patient quite often is feeling these little TIAs, little strokes that are breaking, and they go to lay down. And the question should be, hey, mom or dad, I know you're not feeling well. Can you squeeze my fingers here real quick, smile for me, and do that quick little check. That quick little check can make all the difference in how they might do if they're having a stroke. And for those rural patients, their best choice is to get to any hospital. And in many parts of the country now, they're setting up hub and spoke systems. So I believe even in Ohio, who by the way has some of the best stroke centers in the United States and in the world, they have systems of care now that work at a hub and spoke. So you can go to a rural hospital, the films are sent to the main comprehensive stroke center, they pick them up in helicopters and they bring them in. So go to the nearest hospital if you're in any type of rural setting.
I took a look at Stryker's neurovascular page, and I mean, the list of medical devices that you have is incredible. So of those, how many of those devices are specific to this? And what do you see on the horizon? What is next in the technology coming down the pipe?
Yes, thank you. Yeah, when I was a younger man, I was a part of the team that helped create some of the very first products, and we had to prove we could operate in the brain through the right leg. So we first have a set of products that are our access products. These are catheters and wires that allow us to quickly and safely move up the aorta, come up through the carotids, and to get into position. So if you can't get there, you can't treat the patient. And these are catheters, to give everyone perspective, they're about 5 feet long, the wires and catheters. A catheter is about the size of a pencil lead, and the wire is a little thicker than a human hair. So our products are very long, they're very delicate, but we have to make them safe so we can traverse through the body without causing any other damage. But then we have treatment devices. And so when we're looking at a clot, we have 2 ways to remove a clot. We can grab the clot and pull them out, or sometimes we just try to hoover them out. We aspiration them out. We can take big lumens and we just turn on aspiration and we try to suck it out. It depends on the anatomy. It depends on, is the clot hard and organized or is it soft and jello-y? So we have different ways to remove the clot. On the bleed side, we have coils and different stents to stop that bleeding in a bleeding aneurysm. So now, where are we going next? I can tell you now that we've proven the concept that we can get there safely and we can get the clots out safely. I see some things on the horizon that are very exciting. First, in the actual treatment, our R&D team right now, and I'm sure my competitors as well, are working on devices that can remove the clot so fast and so effective that we're talking seconds. So what used to be minutes or 15 minutes or a half hour will be seconds. What I'm also seeing is technologies that go into ambulances that will be a great benefit. So say you're an emergency responder and you get there and you see a young female on the ground. They may not think stroke because she looks young and healthy. They think seizure, maybe trauma, alcohol or drugs. Stroke is probably the last thing on their minds. But there's a rare side effect of birth control pills, and that is clot formation in some patients. So it's sad that young women get misdiagnosed all the time. And then they have the impact of stroke on their brains for the rest of their lives. So I've seen 5 new startups with technologies that go onto your head. They're helmet type apparatuses They can shoot wavelengths through the brain, radio wavelengths through the brain, and they can see whether it's an ischemic attack, a hemorrhagic attack, or something else. And if some of these, which I believe will soon be approved by FDA within the next 24 months, that changes everything, because now the ambulance drivers know they have an ischemic stroke and they can go right to that nearest hospital. In fact, while they're driving, they're already communicating and the emergency rooms are there to quickly receive them. So that's the part that's most exciting to me. And then further out, Monica, we're all looking at robotics. You could have someone in the Cleveland Clinic treating stroke through a robot to those outer hospitals someday.
That's the other thing. You had mentioned the helmets. I'm wondering if when you're dealing with a clot stroke, if an ultrasound or some type of device would be beneficial to just put on the head, turn it on, and it breaks up the clot. I mean, is that even realistic?
Well, there's therapeutic ultrasound and some recent breakthroughs with that technology where you can now ultrasound through bone. So that's kind of opening up that whole new world. There are startups that now use ultrasound that are robotic ultrasound technicians. And when you put on the headset, inside are little robots moving the ultrasound probes around where they can say, hey, you've got an occlusion in your middle cerebral artery. And so that's probably the first step. Down the road, the challenge with just breaking it up is that clot breaks up. It's now showering deeper into the brain. And you're now causing multiple stroke hits across the whole hemisphere. So it's to the patient's advantage to get the clot removed out of the brain to the leg versus having it shower deeper into the brain, if that makes sense.
I know you mentioned women and birth control pills, but women are still at higher risk for stroke. But why is that?
You know, we don't know. And it's higher on bleeds, on hemorrhagic and aneurysms, and it's higher on ischemic stroke. But I think of and women get misdiagnosed all the time in our country, and it's wrong. And so we need to do a lot more here. I don't know how your family works, but you know, you take out my wife and my sister and my mom and my aunts, our family paralyzes. And I really look at what we're doing is saving the family unit, because 65% of my patients are women. And so when I see a patient on the table, I'm thinking about, we're saving not just this patient, we're saving her family. And that's kind of how I look at it. And that's part of our mission and our sense of urgency is we want to help these patients.
Again, I want to open it up to questions for our participants. Feel free, if you have any questions for Mark, please just put them in the Q&A section. I'm just curious, so I'm just going to keep hassling you.
Okay, I'm good.
We have one. Hold on one second. Okay, Jeff wants to know, from an economic perspective, what will limit the number of these comprehensive centers, the cost of equipment or the cost and supply of trained staff?
You know, it's a good question. These rooms are expensive. These are full-out angio suites, similar to a cardiology lab. Unfortunately, you can't share those labs. They're very, very different in design, even though they're using fluoroscopy. And you don't want to stop the treatment of heart attacks with cath labs. So this is a new room. They cost around $3 million, $3.5 million to install. You have to have the neurosurgeons that have gone on to do additional training to do these less invasive procedures. And you have to have the staff, and they have to run 24 hours a day. But when you look at the amount of strokes that are not being treated, and the question that may be followed up on is, why aren't they being treated? Well, they're showing up after 24 hours, or they go to the wrong hospital. And then the impact of the stroke is too late. So there are thousands and thousands of untreated patients. And so I think what hospitals are starting to see is, number one, this is a profitable procedure for them. They want those stroke patients in. They know they can treat them effectively, and the reimbursement codes allow that. And they also know that there's thousands of patients that aren't being treated. And so that's why you're seeing the bigger hospital systems, they want these stroke patients to come in for care.
Again, Jeff, thanks for your question. Anybody else, feel free to type that in the Q&A. You and I were talking about COVID earlier, and I know you know, there's still so much about this disease we don't know, but is Stryker doing anything potentially? Is there anything relating from the vascular sense to COVID? I mean, we do know it affects the brain. We do know it affects the heart.
Yeah, you know, we don't know why yet, Monica, but there is a small group of patients that have a vascular response to COVID where they create clots in the cerebral arteries. You know, we talked about clots are usually coming from a bad valve or some other kind of anomaly that's creating the clot here. It breaks loose, the blood flow carries it to the brain. The difference with these COVID patients is it's forming in their brains. And so I saw a recent publication of a patient having a ischemic stroke on both sides. That never occurs. And the physician pulled out the first side, and while he was still had his foot on the fluoro pedal, he watched a new clot form in the artery. Now that is scary stuff. And we don't see that in our space. That's a rare thing, but these things are being reported. Patients have reported blue toes or blueness around their lips, and it's because the blood flow is being restricted. So in some patients, the disease seems to attack the artery itself. Thank goodness it's rare, but it is happening. So what are we doing about it? Well, we're trying to figure out what we can do to treat these patients. They're different than our traditional patients. Also, broader Stryker, we have other divisions that have worked on, we have special masks and special PPEs. We created special beds that we could make very inexpensively and sell at cost for hospitals that needed beds rapidly through the system. So many of my brother and sister divisions also have products to try and address the COVID pandemic.
You and I have been sitting here on the sidelines watching the amazing medical technology just explode because of this pandemic. What do you think, if there's going to be fallout? You know, obviously not every drug, not every medical device is going to have billions of dollars dumped into it from governments. But what do you think the fallout is going to be for the future of biotechnology, pharmaceuticals, and everything thanks to this pandemic?
Yeah, you know, a couple of things. In the last cycles of political elections, pharmaceutical companies and medical device companies have sometimes taken all the arrows from many of these politicians. When you look what's solving our problem today, government was involved with investment money, but it came down to companies and scientists in those companies finding those solutions. It came down to companies making those plastic vials. It'll come down to companies to move those drugs and products that are needed to treat these patients all through the system of care. So these are companies that are doing this. These are very dedicated people that sometimes take the arrows from politicians, which are a convenient target, but aren't based in a lot of reality. The downside is every single country's version of FDA is asking for more data to prove the safety and efficacy of those procedures. And FDA is doing their job, and they should do their job to protect us. But all those new requirements add cost to development. So for us to bring those first stroke devices to market, it was 6 years of R&D and very expensive long clinical trials. So when we started, I had kids starting high school. When we were done, they were graduated and married. That's the length of time to get approval. Now, we had to prove it though, and you have to generate that data. It just takes a lot of time and a lot of money. So when companies finally do that, then they look for the return afterwards. So sometimes you might look at a device and say, how could a device cost this much? Well, it was the 15 years prior of spending a lot of money to prove out that device or that pharmaceutical drug. So it's important to our nation. It's important to our citizens. FDA's got to do their job. Industry's got to do their job, but working together is the right way to do it safely and effectively. But there's a new burden, and we have to prove that it's worth it, that it's worth it to the families, it's worth it to systems of care, that we're bringing clinical value, but also value in trying to bring healthcare costs down.
I want to throw one more push for questions out there. If you have any for Mark, please put them in the Q&A. While we're waiting, I just want to throw out and give you. Is there any topics that you didn't get a chance to discuss, and your final thoughts on what you're hoping we all leave with today?
Yeah. So the first one, if everyone on this call could promise me, at every family dinner, every family Zoom call, talk about the symptoms of stroke. The average American is amazing. They can tell you the symptoms of a heart attack. very few can tell you the symptoms of stroke. So talk about fast, talk about your face doesn't move, and when the speech is slurred, or you say, Mom, raise your hands up, and one goes up and the other one falls down. Know where the stroke center is. That is my plea to every one of you. And I promise you, there's people on this call, when strokes that happen every 40 seconds, you're going to have a family member in your lifetime, and you're going to see something happening in front of you. You're going to see these symptoms, and I want you to know right where to go and be an advocate for your loved one. In that ambulance, you say, no, you're going to the Comprehensive Stroke Center if I have to get in that ambulance with you, and be an advocate for your loved one.
All right. I'm not seeing any questions. Mark, thank you so much. It was so incredibly insightful. And it's never a bad thing to learn more about, any issue that could affect all of us. And more importantly, your push for all of us to be our own advocates. So thank you so much. For everyone else, I hope you join us for our next Vitals, which is Thursday, January 14th at 5 p.m. We'll have Metro Health President and CEO, Dr. Akram Boutros. On behalf of President Langell and NEOMED, thanks so much for joining us, everyone. Have a safe and wonderful holiday season. Mark, thanks again.
Yeah, thank you, Monica.
Health outcomes. Changes due to interventions. To bring positive change, patient experiences and health must both improve. Healthcare costs must be lowered, and clinician and staff burnout has to end. But our problems are big. 133 million Americans have at least one chronic disease. 500,000 people are dying every year from hospital errors, injuries, and infection. The shortage of primary care professionals will be as much as 100,000 in just the next 5 years. Big problems require bigger solutions. Positive change needs acceleration. It needs to happen now. But these are not so easy solutions that many don't want to hear, and even few are willing to talk about. How to lead such a change? How to discover, discuss, and disrupt healthcare to make a difference now? This is VITALS, Visionary Health Leadership in Action.